I've joked with this with bandmates and other musicians sometimes that there's like there are a lot of people out there who like the idea of being in a band more than they like creating music. That they like the idea that it's going to be some prestigious thing that's going to get them laid and up whenever they want. Got to tell you, there are other routes to doing those things as much as you want, and I really think that you should be valuing the music or treating that as of the utmost importance before all of the
The trappings.
tertiary benefits.
Hey, this is Tom for Ghost Cult Magazine, and it's a great pleasure to be joined by Grant Netzorg of sludge metal spaghetti western three-piece in the Company of Serpents, who are poised to release their latest album, A Crack in Everything. Grant, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So just sort of getting straight into the record, one of the things I really appreciate about it is it has this kind of like cinematic aspect to it, I would say. You've got the contrast of the really kind of crushing, overwhelming, like really sort of like oppressive sludge metal parts. And then you've got the more kind of spaced out sections. You've got these, I guess, where the sort of spaghetti western element comes in, the more sort of twanging guitars. And it really does feel a lot when I'm listening to the album like there's this lone figure that's trudging through the desert, hopefully towards some sign of salvation, but it's not entirely clear. So like, how much did you sort of have that cinematic picture in mind when you were making the album?
Well, first of all, I love that that's the impression you take away from it. I love that imagery of just like the lone figure just kind of forging along in a desolate west or something like that. That's really cool that it's evocative in that way for you, and I appreciate hearing that. It's not really like a hyper conscious decision, but I think those influences kind of filter in via osmosis. I'm a big movie buff, and I love sort of eerie spare scores in film, particularly when it comes to spaghetti westerns or westerns in general, but lots of horror flicks as well. There's some incredible score work touchstones that I think we refer to, for example, like one that I've always really loved well before I started this band was Neil Young's soundtrack to the film Dead Man. It's this great eerie spare, very guitar heavy. I think it's exclusively guitars. Just this smoky desert sort of sound that, he's alternately making these noises emulating the sound of like a train crossing the Western plains in the 1800s, and it works perfectly. And to my ear, it's obviously like a huge influence on like later Earth, who's another major touchstone for me musically. But I've also I grew up watching a lot of like Sergio Leone westerns with Ennio Morricone scores, so those are kind of just etched into my subconscious to a certain degree. So I think a lot of that bleeds through. But I also, I think very early on, especially when looking at some of our peers, I realized that, we weren't in the arms race for most crushingly heavy all the time band. And I like to intersperse those little instrumental passages and bits of ambiance that let it breathe a bit more. Some of our peers locally are bands like Primitive Man, who I adore, but like nobody's going to be heavier than them. So I got out of that arms race pretty early on, and those guys are friends of ours. But like I don't think that I write well if what I'm trying to do is just sonically punishing the entire time, and I don't do it as well as some of my peers, chiefly like bands like Primitive Man, who I just mentioned. So being able to kind of give that space and have that breadth that makes it get that sort of cinematic feel, I think really just lends itself to my writing style. And I feel that it helps make our records have more of a cohesive feel to them and not just feel like, a handful of songs kind of jammed together. For me, it helps create a thread throughout them.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And those are all really interesting reference points. Like from time to time when I am talking about like what's the most crushing, sonically heavy thing I can think of around the moment, like I've definitely mentioned Primitive Man before. It's just like there's no escape from the crush of them. Yeah. So like you say, it's like if you're trying to compete with that, it's really just sending you in one direction. But I do think that, to your point, it really does give this nice contrast, the way the album does flow. And obviously you've got like You got a couple of tracks which are these little sort of instrumental interludes, if I can call them that. And then even within particular tracks, like I was thinking, like Buzzard Logic, for example, I love how that one starts out, and it really does feel like, obviously in the title, that kind of alludes to the idea of being out in the desert, but it really feels that kind of like contemplative at the start, and then it gets heavier and it gets faster as well. So like even within tracks, you've got quite a lot of changes and flows and contrast, which is kind of enjoyable to to go through those arcs when listening to the album.
Yeah, thanks. That one, Buzzard Logic, is one it's kind of prescient that you're interviewing me where I'm sitting right now. I'm in the back bedroom of my sister-in-law's house in the Four Corners area of Colorado. We come down, my wife and I and our daughter come down and visit them probably once a year, usually for the last 5 or 6 years. It's a good 6 to 8 hours from Denver where we live. But that song, Buzzard Logic, I initially started writing here in like 2020 when we were visiting them after our previous record, Lux, had come out. I was monkeying around on my brother-in-law Rob's Martin acoustic and kind of came up with that initial phrase that became the beginning of that song. That's the more I guess subdued, eerier intro before it gets into the full bore heavy stuff. But it was written on an acoustic guitar in the desert, in a very cool part of Colorado. And yeah, like 20 yards from where I'm sitting currently. So that song in particular has its genesis point from where I'm currently sitting.
That's cool. And there's like a couple of things that I wanted to get into about sort of the themes that you're tackling on this album. So, well, sort of before that, actually, one of the funny things for me was that before I read any of the press release, I listened to the album once the whole way through. So I wasn't primed in any way, even about like the reference of the album title. So I got to the end of the record, and then you have the line where you say, "There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets." And I went, hang on a minute, that's Leonard Cohen. And then because I hadn't realized that was the reference to the title. And it's particularly apt for me because my introduction to Leonard Cohen was the Natural Born Killers movie. And there are several tracks from that album, The Future, which are in that soundtrack. So it's cool
Anthem's
for me.
In there.
What was that?
Anthem, that song in particular is in there in the scene where the prison's all like going completely to hell, and like Robert Downey Jr.'s like media Geraldo amalgam is being like carried out by the prisoners. You hear Anthem in the background. It's funny you should say that. That was absolutely the first place I heard Leonard Cohen as well.
Oh, that's funny. Because that was going to be my question. Like, what was your kind of a two-part question. So you've answered the first part, what your introduction was, but why did you feel like you wanted to honor him with that reference on this particular album?
Well, so first of all, I adore Leonard Cohen. He's, an all-time great, and is pretty much insurmountable as a lyricist in my view. His music's been really important to me throughout my life. I discovered him as a kid seeing Natural Born Killers and hearing all that stuff from The Future on that soundtrack. I think it had Waiting for the Miracle, the Future, of course. I've seen The Future Brother, It Is Murder, and Anthem were all on that soundtrack, and I loved all of those. So that was my entry point into Leonard Cohen. And I think I got Songs from a Room shortly after that, and he sounds completely different as a young man, which is ironic because he's at that point he was still in his mid-30s when he began his musical career. And I found out shortly after that my dad had been a huge Leonard Cohen fan. He heard me playing it, and he's like, "Where did you hear this? Like, who told you about Leonard Cohen?" Like, he knew about I knew about Dylan and all the major folk guys of the 60s. My dad was big into a lot of like hippie music from the 60s, but he also, I have an OG copy of the Velvet Underground and Nico with the sticker still intact that I swiped from my dad's record collection when I was like 10. So he had some other darker shit in there too. So it has been a musical touchstone for me for quite a long time. And I was lucky enough to actually see Leonard perform live twice with my dad.
Oh, cool.
Very cool experience. With my father's also a fan, one of which was at Red Rocks, one of inarguably the best concert venues in the world. So it's always been very special music for me. But also like the intensity of his lyrics is just absolutely unmatched. And he's such a just dyed in the wool poet. with how he approaches everything. And I just have the utmost respect for him. And that song Anthem has long been my favorite Leonard Cohen song. And I was trying to think of different ways to kind of, I don't know how to express what I wanted to about the particular breed of darkness that this album expresses or explores, while still being able to play with the theme of light, which has been a common recurring theme for us as sort of this metaphysical abstract or fundamental root essence, sort of prima materia. I like that analogy, and I like that metaphor of light as this sort of life force beyond everything, or that is fundamental to everything. But how do you talk about that in the sphere of utter despair and despondency? And I thought that the line "there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in" was really apt for that, and that it came from one of my all-time favorite artists. Was it's just a cherry on top. So I thought it was perfect for it, and I just kind of that theme hit me when I think we were maybe 2 songs into the 9 that ended up comprising the record, and it just stuck, and I really liked it, and we just kind of ran from there. I think it's also kind of fun to play like very heavy music and include some out of left field influences in there that people don't expect. But I think anybody who listens passionately to music is never surprised when somebody has a broad range of tastes. But there's always some metalhead who's convinced that like some obscure black metal band is like your chief influence, when you're like, nah, man, like I was bumping some Leonard Cohen when I was writing this.
Yeah, well, to your point, and to reference someone that I think it sort of has a certain affinity in terms of some of the music they make, I interviewed Steve Von Till recently.
Nice.
Absolutely lovely guy. And I was I saw on Instagram some little reel, I think it was one of these, fan question things where someone had asked him, like, what's your favorite non-metal music at the moment? And he's just like, this might surprise you, but actually a lot of music that I listen to isn't metal. In fact, possibly most of the music I listen to these days isn't metal. So yeah, exactly, to your point.
That doesn't surprise me at all about that guy. I love Neurosis, and Steve Von Till seems like an amazing person. I've met him a couple times. We pretty early on in I think we were only a band for like 3 or 4 years. We got the amazing opportunity to open for Neurosis in 2014. So that was a absolute bucket list sort of performance for me. And then I've met him once or twice just at different shows over the years. He always seems like an incredibly intense, focused, but very cool artist. The artistry that guy and that band were responsible for was just absolutely next level. But yeah, it surprises me not at all to find out that Steve Von Till isn't constantly listening to metal. I mean, he's on a compilation of Townes Van Zandt covers. So, I mean, what do you expect?
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. Yeah. I was when I was about to talk to him, I was quite intimidated because I just sort of had the sense he's going to be incredibly serious, but he was actually very sweet. So he put me at ease very quickly.
He seems like an awesome guy. I don't know him personally, but major respect.
Definitely the impression that I got. So you touched on the fact that, so I think you said with Buzzard Logic that you actually started coming up with part of the guitars that would end up being in the final track back in 2020, just after you'd put out your previous album. Because I did want to ask you about the gap in between them. And obviously we've all gone through the whole pandemic black hole that sort of sucked everything into like a sense was like, what is time anymore? But from reading the press release, I understand that there's various struggles that you've gone through that led towards the making of the album. I mean, how much of that sort of connected to the whole COVID situation? And, as much as you're comfortable talking about, how would you sort of describe the process of getting from that initial coming up with guitar parts to actually finally having the album finished? Well,
this is one thing that I definitely had some trepidation about when, it became evident what the theme of this record was going to be. It's uncomfortable to talk about addiction and, really holding a mirror up to oneself and, embracing that shadow work. But I also, value honesty. And, if I tried to pass this off as this record being about something other than my struggle with alcoholism, then, it would be a stretch. There are elements of other things that I'm interested in it. Very interested in esotericism, and, various strains of Western occultism. So there are facets of that are interwoven throughout, but chiefly this is a record that's about my struggle with alcoholism. And when you talk about how that works with 2020 and everything that went down, obviously that factored for us specifically. That whole period, like specifically like my family, I don't mean the band. That period was already a very fraught time for us. We lost a close family member to suicide about 6 months before the pandemic shutdowns, and that kind of had set the tone leading into that whole very bizarre period. So things were already kind of at a nadir before us when they broke out the shovels and said, dig deeper, you know? And I think like a lot of folks, you know, like self-medication came in pretty heavily during that time. And, you know, everybody's at home and like with nothing to do. And so why not have a drink? And of course, I've been a very heavy drinker for long before that, but I think that absolutely catalyzed it becoming much worse. You know, for a long time, you know, because I've probably started the first time I got drunk, I was probably 13 or 14. And then I'd say from maybe 17 to I'm now 39, so 38. From 17 to 38, a little over 20 years. I'd say the longest period of sobriety I ever had was maybe 15 days. So most of that time, I considered myself sort of a bon vivant, you know, just somebody who liked to party and enjoyed himself. And for the most part, it didn't really turn me into too egregious an asshole, or at least not one that I was capable of observing when upon self-reflection, you know. And so for a long time, I was basically what most would characterize as like a functioning alcoholic or a high functioning alcoholic. You know, I drank very regularly, wasn't hiding it, wasn't doing really anything sketchy with it other than just having a very outsized or Herculean consumption compared to the average person. But it definitely started to take a darker turn as, you know, we dealt with the aftermath of, you know, suicide of a parent. And then the subsequent shutdowns, you know, we just started to go down a dark hole. And I, in particular, started drinking very, very heavily. And that bon vivant enjoyment of things kind of slipped away. You know, I was the sort of dude who would get passionately into anything that I was interested in, and liquor was no different. Like if you wanted to go on a rant about the different regions of single malt Scotch producers in Scotland, I could tell you about every region and tell you why my favorites are my favorites, even if I haven't had any of them for over a year at this point. Like it was something that I was passionately interested in, but like however fancy a drunk you might be when you think you're at your best, or however cosmopolitan you think you might be, it always ends up in like rot gut vodka, you know, hidden behind shelves and day drinking to quell, you know, withdrawal symptoms. That's really when it became very dark was when physical dependency started to rear its head. I had drank heavily for, like I said, like 20 years without really seeing any sort of dependency issues until, well, I guess it wouldn't have been 20 years. In those last 5 years of my drinking, I started to see the ill effects of dependency, where, you know, you wake up sick and vomiting, you're shaking, and you basically don't feel human until you've been able to get a little bit of that poison in you and just kind of reset, because you've become physically dependent upon it. And that leads to drinking earlier and earlier in the day, and greater quantities. And I recall, you know, when I was a kid, just starting to drink, like if you got a pint of hard liquor, that was like good for a whole night's entertainment. And by the end, like, you know, I remember cracking a joke when I was going through withdrawals, but still trying to like dry myself out and trying to taper. Like my wife was kind and she bought me some vodka to help me taper off of, you know, a very heavy binge. And she came home with like a little pint of vodka. And being a corny dork, I cracked a joke from Zoolander. I was like, what is this, a vodka for ants? You know, like, because a pint of hard liquor was going to do dick shit for me. And that's the problem, you know, when you get physically dependent and you have a Herculean tolerance, you know, burning through a fifth a day is something you do without batting an eye. And often it was north of that. There were days where, I consumed, like an entire handle's worth of hard alcohol, and it's hard to recover from. And it also, like, it's a depressant for a reason. For all of the things I loved about alcohol that, made me feel joyous and social, or just vibrant, those things go away once you crack that physical dependency seal and go down that road, and it becomes darker and darker, and the level of like self-loathing and self-destruction just ramps up incrementally with that, and just gets worse and worse. And, suicidal ideation enters the picture, and just utter despondency kind of takes over. And I could see for several years that this needed to end, and it had become a problem. It wasn't the type of person I wanted to continue to be. First of all, I've got a wonderful 7-year-old daughter and a amazing wife, both of whom I cherish, and I didn't want to drink out of my life or drink myself to death and drink myself out of their lives, So I knew I needed to stop. The other alarming thing about alcohol dependency is it's, as I understand it, it's one of 2 substances where the withdrawals can literally kill you. That and benzos. You can cold turkey heroin, and you will think that you want to die, but it's not going to kill you. But you can literally die from alcohol withdrawals if you're a heavy enough user. And I had a friend, another musician who I won't name, who I had no idea had struggled with an alcohol problem as well, that I heard about trying to go cold turkey, and he had a seizure and had to get hospitalized. And it was terrifying to me. So I was hyper aware of that. And I was also adamantly opposed to getting any sort of medical help or intervention, going through a medical detox. I didn't want it on my records. I didn't want it public. It's embarrassing shit. I'm embarrassed talking about it right now, knowing that this is part of the fucking publicity for our band's new record. It's painful to expose this, a pretty vulnerable part of yourself. But again, I value honesty, so here we are. But that notion of the fact that I had been a heavy enough drinker that I needed to taper or else seek medical intervention, otherwise I was going to have a seizure and potentially die, was very present in my mind. And that kept me from being able to successfully quit for quite a long time, because I would just taper. And then at one point, I'd get 3 to 3 weeks sober. And then, I'd think, oh, well, I got this licked. I better have a drink about it to celebrate, and go right back after it. And the vicious cycle continues. So ultimately, I ended up capitulating and caving in and getting medical attention. And I went to a medical detox for a week, and then a rehab facility for a month. Not something that I was super stoked to do, but it was necessary, and it quite possibly saved my life. All throughout that period, trying to bring this back down to the runway of your original question of how this operates with the songwriting. A lot of these riffs might have had their genesis points before I had made that jump to sobriety. Like the song Endless Well, for example, the opening riff on that is something I had thought about using in a heavy song as many as like 8, maybe even 10 years ago. But I had never written it into anything. But a lot of this stuff did evolve after I made the decision to start getting sober. The only song that was fully written, lyrics aside, prior to going into rehab and entering into sobriety here, or I guess Colorado sober, because I don't drink alcohol anymore. I still will smoke weed and the occasional psychedelic, but alcohol is off the menu. The only one that was really kind of fully formed musically was Ghosts on the Periphery, the final track on the record. But then I didn't finish the lyrics for the subsequent 3 verses. Only the first verse was written before I entered rehab. But I've also, I have a lot of musicians that I'm a big admirer of who have struggled with various episodes in their life, whether it's mental health issues, addiction, etc. And I've always really admired the ones that continued to work through these really fucked up periods in their lives. Like a favorite one that I always love to point out is like people talk about, mental illness and just different things that people struggle with musicians. And people love to point to Brian Wilson and Sid Barrett as being like these acid casualties of the 60s that like fried themselves into schizophrenia or something, which, I'm not saying that's what's happened. I'm saying that gets said a lot. But one artist who I always have loved, who falls in that same category, is Rocky Erickson. And Rocky was given the choice to go to a state penitentiary for something like 20 years for possession of one joint, or he could go to Rusk State Mental Institution. And he chose the mental institution for those draconian Texas marijuana laws. And they subsequently gave him all kinds of electroshock therapy. And by all accounts, he kind of lost his marbles. But the man continued to produce and write music throughout that entire period. And I love that. So I love the notion of continuing to try and write and create when you're, at your nadir, or just experiencing, intense tragedy. Like another favorite artist of mine is Nick Cave. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Of course, Nick Cave suffered horrible tragedies in the loss of several of his children. And there's a great documentary about him in the studio working on that. And, just this urge to just get in and work and still to try and create in the face of that kind of adversity is something I find really inspiring. So while I was doing this, I tried to continue to write, and I have journals full of absolutely terrible lyrics that I produced from that period. But I felt like we were kind of able to glean some stuff that we could work with and subsequently refine after that. But really, a lot of this I began working on while I was still heavily alcoholic or in the throes of active addiction. And then much of it was polished afterwards. Some songs were straight up just written in rehab. Cinders is a song that was almost entirely composed in rehab on a classical acoustic guitar. But a lot of these songs start before that period of sobriety and then were polished later on. Sorry, very long and rambling response.
No. Not
an aspect of your question I missed.
No. That was an amazing answer. And I want to say, first off, thank you for being so open about all of that, because I can understand it is very vulnerable to lay all that stuff out there. But I do think that to get that insight from you is going to be really valuable for a lot of people, because, a lot of people in one way or another, to one degree or another, struggle with addiction. Talking about self-medicating, that's obviously a thing that people do as well, whether they sort of acknowledge it as such or not. And then, going back to talking about the pandemic as well, it did put a lot of people in an environment where if there already were some kind of mental health issues or there was some kind of addiction issues, it really pushed a lot of people into a situation where it became a lot more difficult to kind of find ways around it. So I completely understand about, it's really hard to make ourselves vulnerable. But I also think as well, metal, to a lot of people, like particularly people who aren't into metal, they can think of it as being like, oh, it's the music of tough guys. But, obviously, I love metal. I love loads of other music. Like we talked about, you can like Nick Cave is also one of my absolute favorites growing up as well. So there's plenty of music that I like that's sonically extreme. There's plenty of music that I like that isn't. But I do think for a lot of people, more from a distance, there's this idea of people that play metal as being somehow just tough guys that don't have any sort of emotional feelings. So I do think that that's, it's good for people to sort of see another side of that. And I do also think as well that, from stories of bands like Motley Crue, even though I think anyone that looks at Motley Crue now can go, this is not a romantic story. But, there are plenty of stories of bands of like, the rock and roll excesses of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And, that can be kind of appealing to some people if they go like, oh, this is great, I'm going to be a rock star and I'm going to go and I'm going to drink Jack Daniels every night and that's going to be amazing. So yeah. I think it's good for people to have the cautionary tales to go, yeah, there is another side to these things.
The reality of alcohol dependency is a lot less glamorous than sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I never got into Motley Crue musically nor as individuals. But I will say that, I read The Dirt maybe 20 years ago, and it's a fantastic read because of how fucking debauched it is. Like those guys are utter dirtbags, and it's very entertaining. It's also no way to live. But I mean, I don't know. A lot of my artistic heroes were kind of questionable, and it's no stretch to see why I kind of went down the roads I did. Some of my musical heroes, like a guy like Lemmy Kilmister. If you're into heavy music, how do you not fucking adore that guy? And like, guy had a fifth of bourbon a day diet mixed with heavy amphetamine use well into his 60s. And not many people can pull it off. And that's one of my musical heroes, or just personal heroes. Dude was just awesome. But then also, like writers like Charles Bukowski and Hunter S. Thompson were people that in my youth I loved quite a bit. With Hunter Thompson, it was like the lifestyle was almost more appealing than his actual writing. Like the only stuff I really liked from his writing was like the early shit, like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Hell's Angels, and the Rum Diaries were the only ones that I actually like really enjoyed reading. A lot of it's like you have to be, pretty into or aware of like the 1970s political scene and like have
Some
a
of it
real
does get quite
interest in, George McGovern, who like I was born in 1985. I missed that entire period. So like reading The Great Shark Hunt is insightful, but like, for me, Hunter Thompson was mostly about like getting fucked up and, being creative and wild while still, intelligent and being an utter hedonist. And that was appealing to me. The hedonic parts of rock and roll excess, I definitely understand the appeal of, but, that's also not why you should be making music. I've joked with this with bandmates and other musicians sometimes, that there's just like, there are a lot of people out there who like the idea of being in a band more than they like creating music. That they like the idea that it's going to be some prestigious thing that's going to get them laid and fucked up whenever they want. Got to tell you, there are other routes to doing those things as much as you want, and I really think that you should be valuing the music or treating that as of the utmost importance before all of the
the trappings,
tertiary benefits.
Yeah.
But yeah, like sex, drugs, and rock and roll is appealing, but like we're not all Lemmy Kilmister. We're not gonna fucking be able to drink a fifth of bourbon a day and several grams of amphetamine into our late 60s and survive it.
Yeah, that's
not
true.
Everybody is a fucking tank like him.
No, indeed. I remember there was that line from him at one point where he's talking about back in the day taking acid. I think this was the time where he was like guitar tech for Jimi Hendrix, and he said he had some offhand remark where he's just like, yeah, we took a lot of acid, and if you could handle it, it was fine, and some people couldn't handle it, and then that was it. Like, shit, yeah. All right.
Yeah, no, he's great. His book's a lot of fun. And another fun quote from him was that he got effectively fired from Hawkwind for doing the wrong kinds of drugs. Like they were all really into drugs, but because he was doing speed, which was profoundly uncool in like the psychedelic scene, he was fired for that, and then started Motorhead, which is a slang term for speed freak. But yeah, that's. Yeah, I mean, not everybody's Lemmy. Another thing he said in his book that's like weirdly more impactful for me now, having experienced alcohol dependencies. He talked about a lot of his friends getting older and quitting and then dying because they'd relapse and then or whatever. And his advice was like, well, if you never quit in the first place, you can't have a relapse. But I've learned about this now that I've experienced physical dependency, that like there is something called the kindling effect with alcohol in particular, where you can cross a threshold of dependency, and each time you break it, but then get clean and then come back, it's easier to cross that threshold once you've done it before. And it's more and more addictive and more damaging each time you do it. So it takes less for you to become addicted again. And the ill effects and horrible hangovers and horrible physical effects hit you that much harder once you've done it. And especially once you've done it dozens of times, as I have. So there's a kernel of truth in Lemmy's stuff there. Had I just decided to just forever fucking, drink north of a fifth of hard alcohol a day, I probably wouldn't experience the withdrawals because I'd just be permanently fucked up. But
yeah, it's pretty heavy. I mean, I guess in a way he was kind of a special case, and I don't really know the ins and outs of exactly how he got through his regime, let's say, but it kind of seemed like he managed to get to a level where it was just like, this is my level, and I'm just like, it didn't escalate. I don't know, I could be wrong about that. I don't really know the ins
Yeah,
and outs enough.
I think the guys that do it successfully just kind of hit a plateau and they just keep on that plane. They don't go above it. They
Yeah.
don't go below it, because you go
Mm.
below it, you start withdrawing and you have horrible effects. You go above it and you got to keep pushing the limit.
Yeah.
The fact that he was a lifelong speed user too, I think factors hugely, because like when you're drinking a fifth a day, it saps the fuck out of your energy. Like I could get 12 hours sleep and wake up tired
Yeah.
when I was drinking heavily, and it just saps so much from you, and like you just feel utterly drained and weirdly vampiric. You
Yeah.
know, I think there's no way you function at a level like Lemmy's without having the uppers there to counteract the constant downers.
That is a very valid point. Steering into something that's more directly about the music, I wanted to ask you a bit to go back to the formation of the band. So, from what I understand, you started the band with Ben Pitts with your no, you did
No.
not. Tell me the origin of
Sure. Yeah.
of the band.
And I mean, we haven't talked a lot about it, so it's no shame on you for for like not knowing it. So I started the band with JJ and Selmy in 2011, and we were a two-piece, just myself on guitar and vocals and JJ on drums. JJ lived in Denver at that time, and was performing in another country band. I actually don't even remember the name of the band he was performing with, but I was performing with kind of a pseudo country / rock band called Bone Orchard Revival, and we were both on the same bill. And during my sound check, I was warming up with or just getting levels with some Earth riffs from the record "The Bees Made Honey in the Lion's Skull." And JJ recognized them. That was a pretty new release at that time. Like I think it came out like a year or two prior, and he immediately recognized the work. And he's like, "Oh, you're into Earth, man." I'm like, "Well," and then we started talking about doom and sludge and stoner rock and all that, and really like the full brunt of that resurgence of those bands hadn't quite hit at that stage. It still felt relatively underground. So we're like, neither of us had friends that wanted to play that music. So we decided to start a band ourselves and start writing that. So JJ and I wrote and recorded the first record within a few months of meeting each other. Like we started the band and recorded the record, but within 9 months, he had already accepted a teaching position at a college in Fresno and moved out there. So we like before the record was even out, he had like basically left the band. But initially I was like, well, fuck it, I'll just start a new band. But JJ was like, no, man, like you've created a sound with this music, you should carry it on. And so with his blessing, I then found somebody else to fill his shoes, a guy named Joe Weller-Meyer. And Joe and I remained a two-piece for the subsequent 7 years that he was in the band. And right towards the end of Joe's tenure, Ben Pitts joined on bass and lap steel guitar. I had known Ben from a bunch of other bands, but mostly his previous project, Black Sleep of Kali. But he's a multi-instrumentalist, great dude, and just talented musician. And at that point, as a two-piece, having been a two-piece up through our last record as a two-piece was Ein Safar, I felt that in order to expand what I wanted to do or achieve what I wanted to do sonically, we needed to have an additional member, because I didn't want to rely heavily on studio tricks that couldn't be replicated live. Like one example is I'd been using drones on a lap steel guitar tuned to an open minor tuning on all of our recordings, save for the very first one. It's something I picked up after seeing Swans live in like 2012. Christoph Hahn has several lap steel guitars arranged on a table in different tunings, and he'll just kind of drone the slack key on the strings on a particular note, and it creates this crazy ethereal sort of ghostly haunting sound. And I immediately wanted to start playing with that, and so we've incorporated that approach in the background of a lot of our music. But where it was on records, I would have to, if I wanted to do it live, I recorded myself doing it onto a sample pedal that I could then hit from my pedal board while playing live to have this drone in the background. And it's just, it doesn't have that live performance aspect of it that I really cherish as a fan of music and also a performer of it. So we brought Ben in like early 2018 to play lap steel and bass. So flesh out that sound. I think for a long time too, because we were a two-piece with no bassist in a fucking doom band, people were like, when are you going to get a bassist? I kind of defiantly was just like, fucking never quit asking. Because I'd done a lot with my rig to really heft or flesh out the heft of the sound. I have a very unconventional rig for my guitar. I basically play through a full bass stack and a full guitar stack for my heavy sections, and I have part of the signal going to the bass amp dropped an octave. So it really does fill out a lot of that sonic territory that a bass would previously have covered or traditionally have covered. And that's kind of a vestigial tale of us being a two-piece that I retain today. Like, I can't get away from that tone. Anything else sounds thin to me for this band and these tunings. So I still have these crazy low register tunings and approaches to it, but the bass still gives us that extra breadth. And then the lap steel is something that Ben's kind of run with live. Like, he does the drones that were present on those records that I was, trying to do my best Christoph Hahn impersonation, from this reborn post 2010 Swans era. And Ben also added all these other flourishes, and he kind of developed a technique where he'll be hammering on and sliding into notes with his left hand on the neck of the bass, and then still hitting these notes kind of percussively with the key on the lap steel to still make these almost bell-like drone sounds while performing live. And that's helped broaden the sound quite a bit. And then a couple years ago, our friend Andy Thomas joined on drums when our then drummer JP Damron had to leave the band because his other projects were just simply taking up more of his time. We were the least active of his three bands, and he had a lot of other stuff going on. So he left on amicable terms, and Andy Thomas joined. And that's the lineup that you have on this record is Andy Thomas on drums, Ben Pitts on bass and lap steel, and myself on vocals and guitar. There's some other auxiliary instruments just from kind of messing around in the studio. There's some weird Moog synths in there that the engineer Pete DeBoer had in his studio. He's got a crazy great studio filled with like a lot of great analog equipment. We got to record to tape for the first time, which has been a dream of mine for quite some time. But there's a reason why Blended Contagion used him to do their ambient record, because he's just got walls of vintage synth gear and all kinds of really fun toys. So there's some of that on there too. But anyways, I feel I'm rambling a bit more. That's not really about the history of the band, is it?
No. This is all incredibly useful, insightful. And I'm kicking myself as well because I realized that all I had to do was just on Metal Archives, just look at the lineup for the specific albums and go like, oh yeah, Ben hadn't joined at that point. But I suppose also you can take it as a mark of how effectively that you'd worked out putting in the low end, that I was just like, yeah, that was obviously there before.
That's all right, man. Yeah.
And I was going to ask you about Andy Thomas as well, because I was thinking to myself, okay, well, I was aware that there'd been a few different drummers in the band, and I was aware that you'd had other bands you'd been in before. So I thought, well, you've obviously worked with a lot of drummers. And so I was thinking, like, to have Andy Thomas in the band now, like, I think there are certain elements of the album where he really shines. Like, I was thinking Endless Well in particular. Like, I love the kind of, I don't even know quite whether to call it rolls exactly, but he's got this whole sort of like a flourishing pattern that he plays for various sections of it that I think sound really, really cool. So there were aspects where I really enjoyed the drumming, and kind of, it sounds very kind of like loose, but without sounding sloppy, if you know what I mean. Like, it doesn't sound too rigid. It's got that kind of like nice groove to it. And I was just thinking
for Endless Well, are you by any chance thinking about some of his playing, like right in those opening riffs?
Yeah.
There's a lot of tom heavy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's funny that resonated with you, because that was something he came up with that absolutely improved that composition. That was a song that we almost scrapped. So I wrote that initial riff. There's a song off of Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask replica called Moonlight on Vermont that has this really jangly riff, very kind of like piercingly tinny guitars. This and in the back of my head, I thought forever that would make a fucking great riff if you tuned it down an octave and played it very heavy. So I used that as the springboard to start that song, and that's really where the resemblance stops. But we were writing that song, and we had most of it musically written. The lyrics were the last thing to get finalized for that. And we just weren't taking it anywhere that I was happy with. and nothing was really working for the song overall as a composition. And that was one of the ones that I almost scrapped entirely and didn't make it on this record until Andy came in with that drum part. So he started playing what I would call like a very Dale Crover style tom heavy set of fills over that opening intro, and it absolutely made it a much better song for it, and it reignited my interest in that song to the point that it's become one of my favorites on the record. But there was a point where that almost got scrapped, and then he came in with that drum part, and it all came together from there. So it's cool to hear that resonated with you as well.
Yeah, it's a very cool insight. I'm gonna let you get away in a minute, but before we finish, I did want to ask you about the vinyl, because in this digital age, it always kind of warms my heart when I see bands and artists dedicate some time and energy and resources into beautiful physical artifacts. And you do have some really beautiful vinyl editions of the album that are going to be coming out. So can you tell me a bit about how you constructed that physical side of the record?
Certainly. So this is, if you'll afford me 10 seconds, I'll go grab a copy and we can talk about it. Give me one moment. Sorry. All right. So I happen to have one copy of the deluxe edition here with me because I brought it down to give to my sister and brother-in-law who were visiting. So it's not the complete deluxe package. We're still waiting on the slip mats to come in, but this is most of what the deluxe package is. But yeah, I absolutely love over-the-top packaging and really well thought out just record designs. So I'm a fan and collector myself, so I always try to imbue our works with a little bit of that as well. With everything basically being free on streaming, I think it's worthwhile to kind of incentivize those of us that still go out of our way to procure physical media. So I don't know if I can get the light to catch it really here.
Yep, that shows up. Oh, that's awesome.
So this is, the outer cover is a spot gloss printed version of the full cover with these two die cuts kind of matching up to two thematic elements. So we've got this skull kind of on a tower, and on its forehead is our cross insignia. It's being struck by a bolt of lightning. That the direction I gave the artist was, if you look at the Rider-Waite Smith tarot and the tower card, there's this lightning bolt striking it that's reducing it to rubble, and it's about calamity and disaster and things like that if you're into tarot, which is an apt metaphor for this. Also, the idea of just light piercing this sort of decaying object, a skull, and light pouring forth from it, I thought was a cool visual analogy to the record title, A Crack in Everything. That's how the light gets in. So your skull being split by a fucking bolt from the heavens. But here's the full cover. And this is Mike Lawrence who did this art. He's a very talented artist out of Georgia, I believe is where his home base is now, although he's originally from elsewhere. Yeah, I always love going over the top with the packaging. The idea of the lightning bolt is supposed to reflect the same sort of pattern that the lightning bolts in Kabbalistic lore comes down and manifests everything in the Tree of Life. It's a little bit more like that in the block print that I did for the special edition. If you're familiar with that image, I guess I have a tattoo of it. Maybe that's better.
Mm-hmm.
But this sword, so it's alternately known as the flaming sword or the lightning flash of manifestation, but it's this specific pattern that touches on all the spheres of the Tree of Life, as it's basically some abstract thing coming into manifestation in the material world. So I wanted the lightning bolt to reflect that, but also kind of have some hallmarks of the Tower, Major Arcana, and Tarot. The deluxe edition, we only made 100 of, and it's basically got both versions of the vinyl have two covers. There's the outer cover with the black on black and the die cuts revealing the inner cover. And then the deluxe edition is going to be this sort of gold on black. I don't know, you can't call it a splatter. I think they call it half on half, but that doesn't seem right to me either. But it's this kind of cool, weird blob of gold color through the black. And the other ones are white on black for the standard edition. So the deluxe edition, there's 100 copies, and they come with a block print that I carved and print myself, as well as little bling. There's a pendant of our cross insignia that comes with that. And there will be a slip mat of this same cover design as well for your turntable. So there's 100 copies of that. I only released 100, or excuse me, 40 of those online with the idea to sell the rest of the copies at our on our upcoming tour dates and at our record release show. But we've already pretty much sold through all of the 40 that we released online. So I might release like another 20 just to give folks that don't have the opportunity to come see us a shot at getting some of those. But yeah, I always have adored over the top packaging. I'm a nerd for elaborate packaging designs, and I always try to make sure that works its way into what we release. If you're going to go out of your way to pick up something physical, it might as well be fucking cool.
I love it. I love that sentiment. Yeah, I'm staying at my mom's place at the moment. Usually I would have a wall of vinyl behind me, but I had to rein it in a little bit because I got carried away with typo negative, like double, triple vinyl reissues and
Nice.
a couple of other things as well. Where I was just like, okay, there's like a limit to how much I can keep buying this stuff. But yeah, I really appreciate a beautifully constructed vinyl release. So I think that's super cool.
What's the record that you have the most copies of a single release of?
What you mean, like multiple?
Yeah, like you've got different variants of the same album.
Well, I can then reveal that I'm not as extreme as I could be because I don't think there's any. I mean, I've got like basically every Today Is the Day album or Killing Joke album. I have pretty much all of them on CD and on vinyl. Like not all the vinyl, but most of them. And the same with Swans as well. Like I've got every CD and then I've got most of the vinyl. But I have not delved into I'm not like Henry Rollins with I've got to have every single different. Yeah. I've got to have the Argentinian and I've got to have the German pressing. Is that how far have you got into that extreme?
I'm not that bad. I think there's a handful of Sun records that I have multiple vinyl releases because they get very fun with all their various limited releases. I love Killing Joke as well. Jazz Coleman's vocals are a major touchstone for me. I don't have a lot of range, but when I scream or shout, I try to have that same sort of tonality that Jazz does, where he'll have a shout that kind of starts with that, oh, like I love doing that. And it's absolutely influenced by my love of that band. Swans are one of my favorite all-time bands too. I too have pretty much everything they've released, including a lot of like the rare fundraiser CDs where it's like live recordings where they make 1,000 copies to fund the production of the next record. That last one, Live Rope, was awesome. And I've got several of the others as well, but I mean, I'm a collector nerd as well. Like I will stump for physical media for a long time. Like I still have way more DVDs than the average adult.
I ridiculously, my friends make fun of me, but I just went out and bought a DVD player the other week because I'm like, do you know what? I'm fed up of like Netflix and all this stuff. It's like, if I want to watch something, I'm going to go and like, could you go and find DVDs secondhand for like £1 or £2 or whatever?
Yeah,
so it's like, I kind of prefer that fun of like going like, this is what I want and I'm going to find it, like with records, like searching for records is fun.
Well, not to mention that Blu-ray is a wonderful format and like it often has all of these fun extras that you just don't get anymore. I think we really took that for granted in the DVD era, all these extras. And like, it seems like it would be so easy for them to include that in these streaming services. Like have, a director's commentary track as an option for the audio and things like that. But you lose all that shit with streaming. And not to mention, there's the very pernicious possibility that whatever questionable arbiters of taste out there might decide that you don't get to see a certain film and it's just struck from a server and unviewable anymore.
Or they edit bits out.
Yeah. So like an example that I think is an appropriate one is like right now he's enjoying a renaissance as being revered as this sort of groundbreaking, very cool punk filmmaker. But John Waters was not always viewed that way, right? Like people straight up loathed his shit. When Pink Flamingos came out, it infuriated a lot of people, right? And right now, he's got exhibits at the Academy Museum in LA. He's got coffee table books, and he's grown into his weird elder statesman of like punk cinema role, and the guy still rules. But I could see a world where some arbiter of taste is like, Pink Flamingos isn't okay anymore, and so we're striking it from the rolls, and you can't see it, or any other controversial cinema. Like I own a copy of Pasolini's Salo, and it's not a movie I'm going to watch probably ever again. That's like a one and done film.
That was an experience for me. I watched it with my girlfriend at the time, and we had to watch it in two phases. We had a gigantic argument after we got halfway through it, and then we got through the rest of it. That is an experience.
Well, so that's an example. Like it's uncomfortable, like fucked up stuff that is rightly censored in a lot of cases, and I don't agree with censorship in basically any capacity, but I understand not wanting to let children see that film.
Absolutely.
Right. But there's also this weird sort of moralistic current where people think that they have to be arbiters of taste for everyone else and protect them from cursed media, right?
Yeah.
And it makes it so that any film with any sort of modicum of controversy behind it is potentially a target for the morality police. And I don't think censorship is ever going to be a fruitful or positive thing for arts. I absolutely. Oh, my daughter just.
Bye.
I think there was a Mark Twain quote that was something to the effect of censorship is telling a man he can't eat a steak because a baby can't chew one.
That's brilliant.
I like that. Yes. And so, I mean, this is a roundabout way of saying that physical media at least gives you a copy of something that you can watch whenever you want to. And it's not subject to the weird whims of somebody who thinks that they're the morality police of whatever server farm is operating your favorite streaming service.
Totally. Couldn't agree more. And on that totally agreeable and forthright note, Grant, I'm going to let you go away. Thank you so much for your time. It was great to chat to you. And thank you for your candor and for all of your insights.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I appreciate this. And thanks for reaching out to us and listening to the new record.